The objective of this lesson is to multiply a whole number by a decimal in the hundredths using hundredths grids. In previous lessons, students multiplied whole numbers by a decimal in the tenths using arrays and hundredths grids. Today they will use the same methods extended to the hundredths place. In the hundredths grid, each grid represents a whole, each column represents a tenth, and each square represents a hundredth. Let's start with our first problem. Sebastian purchased 3 bottles of water for 74 cents or hundredths. What was the total amount for the water? The expression to represent this situation is 3 groups of 74 hundredths. 74 hundredths is represented on the hundredths grid by coloring in 7 columns and 4 cubes. This represents one group of 74 hundredths. The problem states we need 3 groups. Color in another 7 columns with another color, starting with the last 2 whole columns on the first grid, and 5 more columns on the second grid. Color in 4 more hundredths on the first grid under the other 4 hundredths that were already colored. Do this a third time with another color. Fill in 7 columns starting with the second hundredths grid. To fill in the last 4 hundredths, color the last 2 on the first hundredths grid, and then 2 more in the last hundredths grid. Notice that when the groups are connected together, the answer is easier to see. It is clear to see that there are 2 whole hundredths grids, 2 columns, and 2 hundredths. Sebastian spent $2.22 or hundredths for the water. Another way students may choose to shade the hundredths grid is by shading in the 74 hundredths on each grid. Start by adding all the hundredths for a total of 12 hundredths. Next, count up the tenths for a total of 21 tenths. Add the 2 amounts for a total of 2 and 22 hundredths, or $2.22. While both are correct methods, the first method was easier to see the total. Let's try another problem using the hundredths grid to solve. Michael gets $1.35 each week that he completes all of his chores. How much money can Michael earn in 5 weeks? The equation to represent this problem is 5 weeks times $1.35, or hundredths, per week. Let's draw our first 1 and 35 hundredths. This will be represented by coloring 1 whole hundredths grid, 3 columns, and 5 blocks. Now color in the second group of 1 and 35 hundredths. Let's start by filling in the whole by filling in columns of our partially full hundredths grid. There are 10 columns in one whole, so fill in the last 6 columns of our partially filled hundredths grid, and then 4 more to be the one whole. Now fill in 3 more columns. Next, fill in 5 blocks on our second hundredths grid. This will complete the hundredths grid and make it easier to see the answer in the end. Complete filling in the 1 and 35 hundredths 3 more times using different colors to equal our 5 groups of 1 and 35 hundredths. It is clear to see there are 6 whole hundredths grids, 7 columns, and 5 blocks filled in. Michael can earn $6.75 or hundredths. In our previous problems, we solved whole number by hundredths multiplication problems. Both examples had a product in the hundredths place. Using the decimal product chart, the third row, labeled whole number by hundredth, will have a product in the hundredths place. The objective of this lesson was to multiply a whole number by a decimal in the hundredths using hundredths grids, and we met this objective by solving real-world multiplication problems with decimals to the hundredths visually using the hundredths grid. We also made a generalization using the decimal product chart that a whole number multiplied by a hundredth will have a product in the hundredths.